September 1996. Harpo Studios, Chicago. The Oprah Winfrey Show was taping what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview for Whitney Houston's new film, The Preacher's Wife. Whitney was at the absolute pinnacle of her career. For consecutive #1 singles, over 100 million albums sold worldwide. The voice that defined a generation. She was Hollywood royalty, music royalty, and sitting across from the most powerful woman in television. Everything was going perfectly. The audience was mesmerized. Oprah was in her element. Whitney was radiant in a cream-colored suit, her signature smile lighting up the studio. They had covered the film, her marriage to Bobby Brown, her daughter Bobby Christina, and her upcoming Christmas album. Standard celebrity interview material. But then Oprah opened the floor for audience questions, and a small hand shot up in the third row. What happened next wasn't scripted. It wasn't planned. It wasn't anything anyone could have prepared for. A 9-year-old girl named Maya Thompson asked Whitney Houston one simple question. 7 words that would stop the most powerful voice in music completely silent. 7 words that would make Oprah Winfrey break her own rule about crying on camera. 7 words that would force Whitney to confront a truth she had been running from since she was exactly Maya's age. The question wasn't about music or movies or fame. It was about something far more profound, far more painful, and far more universal than anyone in that studio could have imagined. To understand the magnitude of what happened that afternoon at Harpo Studios, you need to understand who Whitney Houston was in September 1996. She wasn't just successful. She was untouchable. The Bodyguard soundtrack had spent 20 weeks at #1. I Will Always Love You had become the best-selling single by a female artist in history. She had transitioned seamlessly from music to film, proving she could act as powerfully as she could sing. Waiting to Exhale had been a cultural phenomenon just a year earlier. Now The Preacher's Wife was positioning her as America's sweetheart, literally playing an angel sent to help a struggling preacher and his family. The irony of that casting would become painfully clear decades later. But beneath the sequins and the smile, beneath the chart-topping hits and the magazine covers, Whitney Houston was drowning. Not that anyone would have known it. She had perfected the art of the mask. The public persona was flawless, poised, gracious. The girl next door, who happened to have the voice of an angel. Her publicity team had crafted an image so pristine, so wholesome, that even the slightest crack would have been devastating. Whitney's longtime makeup artist and friend, Roxanne Brown, later revealed the truth about those years in a 2017 interview. Every public appearance was a performance, Brown said. Not just the singing, everything. The way she walked, the way she laughed, the way she answered questions. We would spend hours before interviews practicing responses to potential questions. Whitney had to be perfect. Anything less wasn't acceptable to her team, to her family, or to herself. The pressure had started long before fame. Whitney Elizabeth Houston was born into musical royalty on August 9, 1963. Her mother, Cissy Houston, was a gospel legend and successful backup singer who had worked with Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley. Her cousin was Dionne Warwick. Her godmother was Aretha Franklin herself. Music wasn't just in Whitney's blood. It was her inheritance, her birthright, and her burden. From the moment her extraordinary voice became apparent around age 8, Whitney's childhood effectively ended. Cissy Houston, a devoted but demanding mother, saw her daughter's gift and dedicated herself to nurturing it. But nurturing in the Houston household meant discipline, rigor, and unrelenting standards. There were no playdates that interfered with voice lessons. No sleepovers that conflicted with church choir practice. No teenage rebellion that might damage the instrument or the reputation. Whitney's brother Gary Houston remembered those years with a mixture of pride and sadness. Nippy, that was her family nickname. She never really got to be a kid, Gary told Rolling Stone in 1993. While other girls her age were at the mall or hanging out with friends, Nippy was in the studio with Mom or singing at church. She never complained, but you could see it in her eyes sometimes. This longing for something normal. The church was central to Whitney's upbringing. New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, where her mother directed the choir, was where Whitney's voice was forged. Gospel music was the foundation of everything she would later become. But church also meant scrutiny. The daughter of Cissy Houston had to be beyond reproach. Her behavior was constantly monitored. Her friendships were carefully controlled. Her natural exuberance was channeled into performance rather than play. By age 15, Whitney was already performing as a backup singer for her mother and doing solo performances at nightclubs, lying about her age to get in. The juxtaposition was stark. By day, she was a high school student at Mount St. Dominic Academy, an all-girls Catholic school. By night, she was singing in Manhattan clubs where she was exposed to an adult world of drugs, alcohol, and sexual propositions she was far too young to navigate. Robin Crawford entered Whitney's life during those formative years. They met when Whitney was 16, and Robin became her closest friend, her protector, and according to Robin's own 2019 memoir, her first love. The nature of their relationship would remain one of the most closely guarded secrets of Whitney's life. Not because Whitney was ashamed, but because the world she was entering, the world of mainstream pop stardom in the 1980s, had no space for that truth. Clive Davis discovered Whitney in 1983 when she was 19. The legendary producer saw something in her beyond just the voice. He saw a crossover phenomenon, someone who could bridge the gap between black and white audiences, between R&B and pop, between church and secular. But achieving that vision required careful construction. Whitney's image was meticulously crafted, conservative but not prudish, elegant but approachable, black but not threatening, sexual but not overtly so. Every album cover, every outfit, every interview answer was calculated to maintain this delicate balance. The criticism from the black community began almost immediately. When Whitney's self-titled debut album achieved massive crossover success in 1985, many accused her of selling out, of abandoning her roots for white acceptance. The booing incident at the 1989 Soul Train Awards, where Whitney was jeered during a tribute to her success, cut deep. "She's not black enough" became a refrain that would haunt her entire career. But the white mainstream had its own demands. Whitney had to be palatable, unthreatening, a safe black woman who sang love songs, not protest songs, who smiled graciously and never discussed race, politics, or anything controversial. The cost of maintaining this impossible balance was Whitney's authentic self. Every aspect of her private life had to be hidden. Her relationship with Robin, her growing substance use, which had begun as early as her late teens, her rage at being controlled by everyone around her, her deep insecurity about never being good enough, black enough, talented enough, or worthy enough. By 1992, when she married Bobby Brown, many saw it as a rebellion. Bobby was raw, unapologetic, controversial. Everything Whitney's image was not. Their relationship was passionate and tumultuous from the start, but also gave Whitney something she desperately needed: permission to be imperfect. Bobby Brown became both her liberation and her destruction. He introduced her to a lifestyle that was the antithesis of everything she'd been trained to be. Drugs became regular rather than occasional. Public behavior became erratic. The mask began to slip. But here's what no one understood at the time. Whitney didn't fall into drugs because of Bobby Brown. She had been using substances as an escape since her early 20s. Bobby just gave her permission to stop hiding it quite so carefully. By September 1996, when she sat down with Oprah, Whitney was living a double life that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Publicly, she was promoting a wholesome Christian film and preparing for the holidays with her family. Privately, her marriage was volatile, her drug use was escalating, and the weight of maintaining perfection was crushing her. She was 33 years old and had been performing for paying audiences since she was 15. She had never had therapy, never had space to process the loss of her childhood, never been allowed to simply be human and flawed and still worthy of love. That September afternoon, Oprah Winfrey's producers had carefully screened the audience, as they always did. Questions were pre-selected to ensure nothing too controversial or uncomfortable would derail the conversation. The goal was promotion, not revelation. Whitney's publicist had provided a list of approved topics and several absolute no-go zones. Don't ask about Bobby's legal troubles. Don't mention the Soul Train incident. Don't bring up the white-black audience divide. Keep it light. Keep it positive. Keep it safe. Maya Thompson had not been screened for questions. She was 9 years old, attending the taping with her mother, Dr. Jennifer Thompson, a child psychologist from Evanston. Maya loved Whitney's music. Her favorite song was Greatest Love of All, which she had performed at her school talent show. When Oprah announced audience questions were welcome, Maya's hand shot up instinctively. Oprah, with her characteristic warmth, noticed the small hand in the third row. "Yes, sweetheart. You have a question for Whitney?" Maya stood up, tiny in her purple dress, her voice clear and confident in the way only children who haven't yet learned to doubt themselves can be. She looked directly at Whitney Houston and asked, "When you're so famous, how do you love yourself?" The studio fell silent. Oprah's smile froze. Whitney's publicist actually gasped audibly from the wings. This wasn't on the approved list. This wasn't a question about movies or music. This was something else entirely. Whitney's first reaction was to laugh. Not from humor, but from shock. The laugh died quickly when she saw Maya's face. The little girl wasn't trying to be provocative. She genuinely wanted to know. The question came from pure curiosity and perhaps some instinct that even at 9 years old, Maya understood something profound. Fame and self-love might be mutually exclusive. Whitney opened her mouth to give her standard answer. Some version of, "Oh, honey, I'm blessed and grateful, and my family keeps me grounded." The practiced response that deflected rather than revealed. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the innocence in Maya's eyes. Maybe it was exhaustion from decades of lying. Maybe it was seeing in this 9-year-old girl the same age she had been when her own childhood ended and the performance began. Instead of the rehearsed answer, Whitney Houston did something she had never done in a public interview. She told the truth. "That's a hard question, baby," Whitney said, her voice already thick with emotion. "That's probably the hardest question anyone has ever asked me." Oprah leaned forward, sensing something significant was happening. The cameras continued rolling, but everyone in the studio seemed to understand that the show had just shifted from entertainment to something sacred. Whitney stood up from her chair and walked to the edge of the stage, closer to where Maya was standing. She needed proximity for this. She needed to look into the eyes of this child who had just cracked open something Whitney had kept sealed for decades. "How old are you, sweetheart?" Whitney asked. "9, Maya answered. 9 years old," Whitney repeated, and those watching closely could see her eyes glisten. "I was 9 when I realized I had a gift. When I understood that my voice could do things other people's voices couldn't do." She paused, gathering herself. "I was 9 when being Whitney Houston became more important than being Nippy. That was my nickname. Nippy. My family called me Nippy." The audience was completely silent. Even Oprah, who had interviewed thousands of celebrities and was rarely caught off guard, sat motionless. "You asked how I love myself when I'm famous," Whitney continued. "The honest answer? I don't know if I do." The vulnerability in those 6 words, "I don't know if I do," was staggering. Here was one of the most successful, celebrated, admired women in the world admitting to a 9-year-old stranger and millions of viewers that she didn't know how to love herself. Whitney sat down on the edge of the stage, her legs dangling like a child's. It was such an unguarded, unstar-like gesture that it made what was happening even more powerful. "Let me tell you something, Maya. Can I call you Maya?" The little girl nodded. "Let me tell you what happens when you become famous young. People stop seeing you as a person. You become a thing. A product, a voice, an image. And if you're not careful, you start seeing yourself that way too." What followed was 7 minutes of raw, unfiltered honesty that would become one of the most memorable moments in Oprah Winfrey Show history. Whitney talked about her childhood in a way she never had publicly before. She described the pressure of being Cissy Houston's daughter, the weight of having Aretha Franklin as a godmother, the expectation that she would not just be good, but transcendent. "When I was your age," Whitney told Maya, "I was already performing. And every time I walked on stage, I carried everyone's expectations. My mother's dreams, my family's legacy, the church's standards. There was no room for little Nippy who just wanted to play outside or watch cartoons or have a normal slumber party." She described how her voice became both her gift and her prison. How every conversation eventually turned to her talent. How people treated her differently once they heard her sing. How she learned early that her value was tied to her performance. "I remember being 11 years old and singing at church," Whitney said, her voice breaking. "I hit this note, this high note that everybody said was impossible for someone my age. And afterward, all these adults were hugging me and crying and telling me I was anointed, special, chosen. And I felt happy for about 5 seconds, but then I felt scared because I thought, what if I can't hit that note next time? What if I'm only special when I'm singing? What if the thing that makes everyone love me is the only thing that makes me worth loving?" The audience began to react audibly. Quiet gasps, sniffles, the recognition of a universal truth. We all fear, on some level, that we're only valuable for what we can do rather than who we are. "You asked how I love myself when I'm famous," Whitney continued. "The truth is, I don't know who myself is separate from the fame. I've been performing since I was so young that I never got the chance to figure out who Whitney is when she's not Whitney Houston." She turned to look at Oprah. "You understand this, Oprah. When you're a black woman achieving at the level we're achieving, the pressure is crushing. We can't just be good. We have to be perfect. We have to represent. We carry everyone's hopes and everyone's criticisms. The black community says we're not black enough. The white community says we should be grateful they're accepting us. And somewhere in the middle, we lose ourselves. Oprah was crying now, not the careful single tear of a host maintaining professional composure. Real crying. She didn't try to hide it. Whitney saw Oprah's tears, and her own began flowing freely. "I have a daughter," Whitney said, and her voice became fierce with a mother's protective love. "Bobby Christina. She's 3 years old. And I look at her, and I see this perfect, innocent little person, and I'm terrified. I'm terrified that she'll grow up thinking she has to be perfect to be loved. I'm terrified that she'll inherit this burden of performance. I'm terrified that she'll learn what I learned, that love is conditional, that it's something you earn through achievement rather than something you deserve just for existing." The camera cut to audience members openly weeping. This was no longer an interview. It was a mass catharsis. Whitney wiped her eyes and looked back at Maya, who was also crying, though perhaps not fully understanding why. "Baby girl, you asked me a question that I don't think I've ever asked myself out loud. How do I love myself? And the answer I'm going to give you is the answer I need to hear myself say." She took a deep breath. "I love myself by remembering that Whitney Houston, the famous person, isn't the real me. She's a character I play, a role I perform, and she's exhausting. But Nippy, the girl from Newark who loved to laugh and eat her mama's cooking and just be silly with her friends, she's still in here somewhere. And I have to find her again. I have to remember that I was lovable before I was famous, which means fame isn't what makes me worthy." Whitney stood up and walked back to her chair beside Oprah, but she kept her eyes on Maya. "You know what else I'm going to tell you? Something I wish someone had told me when I was 9. You're not what you do. You are not your accomplishments. You are not other people's opinions of you. You are a soul, a spirit, a child of God, and that's enough. You don't have to earn love. You don't have to perform for acceptance. You just have to be." The studio erupted in applause, but Whitney raised her hand to quiet them. She wasn't finished. "I'm going to make you a promise right now, Maya. I'm going to make me a promise. I'm going to start asking myself that question every day. How am I loving Whitney today? Not Whitney Houston the singer. Whitney the woman. The flawed, complicated, scared, brave, strong, weak, all of it woman. Because if I don't learn how to love her, really love her, then all of this means nothing." She gestured around at the studio, the cameras, the trappings of fame. The awards, the hit records, the magazine covers. None of it matters if I don't know how to look in the mirror and love the person looking back without all the makeup and costumes and performances. Oprah, who had been trying to compose herself, finally gave up. She stood, walked to Whitney, and embraced her. No words. Just two powerful black women who carried the weight of representation, expectation, and the constant pressure to be superhuman, holding each other in front of millions of viewers. When they separated, Oprah turned to the camera, mascara running, voice shaking. "We're going to take a commercial break," she said, "because I think we all need a moment." But the cameras didn't cut away immediately, and in those extra few seconds, viewers saw Whitney walk over to Maya and kneel down in front of her. "Thank you," Whitney said to the little girl. "Thank you for asking me that question. You just gave me a gift, baby. You reminded me that I need to start being honest. With myself and with everyone else." During the commercial break, something unprecedented happened. Oprah made the decision to scrap the rest of her planned show and dedicate the entire remaining time to this conversation. When they came back from break, she asked Whitney if she would be willing to continue talking about this. Whitney agreed, and what followed was 40 more minutes of the most honest conversation about fame, identity, and self-worth that had ever been broadcast on mainstream television. Maya Thompson, the 9-year-old who asked the question, would remember that day for the rest of her life. In a 2019 interview, 23 years later, Maya, then a therapist specializing in childhood trauma, reflected on that moment. "I didn't fully understand what I was asking at the time," she said. "I just knew that Whitney Houston seemed sad to me. Even when she was smiling, there was something sad in her eyes. So I asked the question I ask myself when I'm sad. How do I love me? I didn't know it would break her open like that." Maya's mother, Dr. Jennifer Thompson, used the footage from that Oprah episode in her psychology practice for years. Whitney articulated something that so many high-achieving individuals struggle with, Dr. Thompson explained. The conflation of achievement and worth. The fear that love is conditional on performance. Children of demanding parents, gifted children, children thrust into adult responsibilities too young, they all carry this wound. Whitney gave voice to it in a way that helped countless people begin their own healing. The episode aired in October 1996 and became one of the highest-rated Oprah episodes of that season. But more significantly, it sparked a national conversation about child stars, perfectionism, and the cost of fame. Oprah herself cited the Whitney interview as one of the most important of her career. "That wasn't an interview," Oprah said years later. "That was a soul crying out for help, for understanding, for permission to be human." And it came from the question of a child who hadn't yet learned to ask the safe questions. The impact on Whitney's career was immediate and complex. Some praised her vulnerability. Others criticized her for showing weakness. The Black community had mixed reactions. Some saw it as Whitney finally being real. Others felt she was airing dirty laundry that should have stayed private. The white mainstream media largely treated it as a sympathetic human interest story, though some tabloids spun it as evidence of instability. But the real impact was on Whitney herself. Close friends noticed a shift after that interview. Robin Crawford wrote in her memoir that Whitney talked about the Oprah interview frequently in the months that followed. She kept saying that little girl asked her the question she'd been avoiding her whole life, Robin wrote. For a while, she really tried to find Nippy again. She tried to separate the person from the persona. It was like watching someone try to excavate their own soul. The struggle was real and ultimately unsuccessful. Whitney's substance use continued and escalated. Her marriage to Bobby Brown became more chaotic. The pressure to maintain her career, her image, and her family proved too much. By 1999, just 3 years after the Oprah interview, Whitney's voice was noticeably declining, and rumors about her drug use were becoming impossible to ignore. The question Maya Thompson asked in 1996, "When you're so famous, how do you love yourself?" became more devastating in retrospect. Because the answer, it turned out, was that Whitney Houston never fully learned how. She tried. God knows she tried. Multiple stints in rehabilitation. Moments of sobriety and hope. Attempts to reconnect with her gospel roots and find the spiritual foundation that had once sustained her. But the damage went too deep. The split between Whitney and Nippy, between the public persona and the private self, had become too wide to bridge. The performance that began when she was 9 years old never really ended. Even in her most private moments, Whitney struggled to know which version of herself was real. When Whitney died on February 11th, 2012, found submerged in a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, the world mourned the loss of a transcendent talent. But those who had watched that 1996 Oprah interview mourned something else. They mourned the little girl named Nippy who never got to grow up on her own terms, who never got the chance to figure out who she was separate from what she could do. In the aftermath of Whitney's death, Maya Thompson, then 25 years old, was contacted by numerous media outlets wanting her perspective as the person who had asked Whitney the question. Maya declined almost all interviews, but she did write a letter that was read at one of the many Whitney Houston memorial services held across the country. "I was 9 when I asked Ms. Houston how she loved herself," Maya's letter said. "I'm 25 now, and I understand the weight of that question in ways I didn't then. I also understand that she answered me with the only honesty she had available. She didn't know. And the tragedy isn't that she didn't know. The tragedy is that we live in a world that makes it nearly impossible for our most gifted, most celebrated, most visible people to love themselves simply for being rather than for performing. We take their gifts and we demand more. We take their vulnerability and we exploit it. We take their humanity and we forget it's there." Ms. Houston tried to tell us that day in 1996. She tried to warn us. I hope her death means we finally listened. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Whitney's struggle with self-love was watching her daughter, Bobbi Kristina, inherit the same wound. In the 2012 interview Bobbi gave just months after her mother's death, she talked about watching that Oprah episode as a teenager. "I saw my mother talking about being 9 years old and losing herself," Bobbi Kristina said. "I was 9 when I first realized that being Whitney Houston's daughter meant I would never just get to be Chrissy. I would always be compared to her, defined by her, expected to live up to her or differentiate myself from her. Either way, I wasn't allowed to just be me." The parallel was devastating. Whitney feared passing on the burden of performance and conditional love to her daughter. Despite her awareness, despite her attempts to do things differently, the cycle continued. When Bobbi Kristina died in eerily similar circumstances to her mother in July 2015, found unconscious in a bathtub and dying months later without regaining consciousness, the tragedy felt complete. 2 generations. Two women who had everything the world values and nothing that actually matters. Fame, fortune, beauty, talent. But not the simple, essential knowledge of how to love themselves. The question Maya Thompson asked Whitney Houston in 1996, how do you love yourself when you're so famous, remains unanswered. Or perhaps the answer is simply this: you can't. Not if fame comes too early. Not if performance replaces personality. Not if the world's love becomes conditional on your gifts rather than recognition of your worth. Today, Maya Thompson runs a therapeutic practice in Chicago, specializing in helping performers, particularly young performers, maintain their sense of self amid professional demands. She cites her brief interaction with Whitney Houston as the founding inspiration for her work. That moment taught me that we have to ask the hard questions, Maya says, especially of people who seem to have everything. Because often, the people who shine the brightest in public are struggling the most in private. And if we don't create space for them to be honest, to be flawed, to be human, we lose them. The footage of Whitney's vulnerable moment on Oprah has been viewed millions of times online. It's used in psychology courses, addiction counseling training, and discussions about childhood trauma. Mental health professionals point to it as a perfect illustration of the concept of the false self, the protective persona we create to win love and acceptance, while our true self remains hidden and unloved. Music historians study it as a turning point, the moment Whitney Houston began the painful process of trying to shed the perfect image that had made her famous, but had also trapped her. And in churches across America, particularly black churches where Whitney's gospel roots ran deep, pastors use her story as a sermon illustration. About the difference between worldly success and spiritual wholeness. About how we can have the whole world and still lose our soul. About how God doesn't love us for our gifts, but for our essence. The same message Whitney tried to give Maya and herself that day in Chicago. You don't have to earn love. You just have to be. The saddest part of Whitney Houston's story isn't that she died too young or that her talent was cut short. The saddest part is that one of the most gifted, most celebrated, most extraordinary human beings to ever live never fully believed she was worthy of love just for being Whitney. Not Whitney Houston the voice. Not Whitney Houston the star. Just Whitney. Just Nippy. Just the girl who wanted to play outside and eat her mama's cooking and be silly with friends. A 9-year-old girl asked her one question: when you're so famous, how do you love yourself? And Whitney Houston, in a moment of devastating honesty, gave the only answer she had. I don't know if I do. That answer, that confession, that plea for understanding should haunt us all. Because we're the ones who created a world where the question was necessary. We're the ones who loved Whitney Houston's voice more than we loved Whitney Houston the person. We're the ones who demanded perfection and punished humanity. Maya Thompson is 37 years old now. She has a daughter of her own. A daughter she named Hope. When people ask why that name, Maya tells them about meeting Whitney Houston when she was 9 years old. About asking a question she didn't fully understand. About watching one of the strongest women in the world break down and admit she didn't know how to love herself. I named her Hope, Maya says, because I hope we're building a world where the next Whitney Houston, the next extraordinary talent, can also just be a person. Where gifts are celebrated but not demanded. Where love is given freely rather than earned through performance. Where a 9-year-old girl never has to ask a 33-year-old woman, when you're so famous, how do you love yourself? Because the answer should be obvious. The same way everyone loves themselves. By remembering that you're worthy simply because you exist. If this story moved you, if Whitney's vulnerability touched something in your own soul, remember that her greatest gift wasn't her voice. It was her honesty in that moment with a child brave enough to ask the question the rest of us were too scared to voice. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't tied to their achievements. That they're lovable not for what they do, but for who they are. And maybe, in remembering Whitney Houston's struggle, we can all ask ourselves Maya's question. Not when you're famous. Just, how do you love yourself? If you don't have a good answer, you're not alone. Whitney didn't either. But asking the question is where healing begins.